This is the Aptitude Outdoors Podcast, where we interview travelers, explorers, and outdoorsmen and women to bring you the best tips and stories from around the world. Hey everybody, welcome back to the Aptitude Outdoors Podcast. Thanks for tuning back in. Tonight we have a very special guest, the one and only Mr. Erik Schlimmer. Now, for those of you who don't know Erik, he is an outdoorsman, and to say he's an outdoorsman is a massive understatement. Erik has, he's not only an author, but he's done a ton of mountain summiting. He's thru-hiked the Adirondack route multiple times. He created the Adirondack route. He's hit all the 2,500 foot mountains in the Adirondacks. He's done some High Peaks Wilderness Area Trail. He's done Catskill's 200 highest mountains, Southern Appalachian, 5,000 footers. He's thru-paddled the Delaware River and the Susquehanna River. He's just an insanely great outdoorsman. He shares some awesome stories with us tonight. When he reached out to me, I was very excited. So you're in for a treat. Let's just hop right into it because Erik has a lot of awesome stuff to tell us tonight. Hey, Erik, how are you doing today, man?
I'm good. I'm doing well. Thanks for having me. Appreciate it.
Oh, man, I'm actually very excited to have you on the show. You are like a legit explorer, like adventurer. I've been, listening to a lot of podcasts you've been on, been following a lot of the stuff you've been doing. You were on my good buddy's podcast, 46 of 46 podcast.
Yeah.
And I mean, I'm just super excited to hear some of your other adventures. So before we dig into some of the stuff you've done, why don't you give everybody, my audience, a little background on who you are and kind of where you came from and how you got into be basically a badass adventurer. It's the only way to put it.
Well, I'm flattered. Thank you. It was a long journey. I actually grew up as a city kid. I was born in 1973, so I'm 47 years old. And grew up as a city kid. And then that was in southern New York, Hudson Valley, about an hour north of New York City. But I tell people I really grew up in the Adirondacks. So I moved to the Adirondack Mountains with my family when I was about 12. And, when in Rome. So I started hunting and fishing and riding ATVs and mountain bikes and snowboarding and skiing, and kind of there's not a whole heck of a lot to do in a remote mountain range except recreate in the mountains. And I just fell in love with the mountains. I like the simplicity. I like the challenge, the reward, just so many things about it. In the early 1990s, I went into the military and I joined the infantry. And see, the military is very good at ruining things that would be otherwise fun. Look at what they did to music. It's criminal, So I joined the infantry and carried this ridiculous backpack everywhere. And, it's just a very rough and tumble way of camping. Of course, the whole time somebody's screaming at you. So I kind of actually swore off hiking when I was in. I'm never, ever going to carry a backpack again. I'm never going to sleep in the woods. But hey, what do I know? Got back into it. And then I did a lot of long distance hiking, long distance mountain biking, long distance canoeing, peak bagging, sleeping in the woods, off trail travel, snowshoeing, you kind of name it. I was doing it outside through the 90s and the first decade of the 2000s. And then I turned 47 years ago and I was like, maybe I should get a real job. Maybe it's time to finally grow up.
Nah.
And so I actually have a real job now, though I spend usually every weekend, typically, still in the mountains.
It's funny you say that because my grandfather and my cousin, both Marine Corps guys, and they say the same thing. I'm like, oh, I love backpacking. I go outside and they're like, you're out of your mind, dude. That's like the worst thing ever in their minds because it's so nasty and like brutal to them. So I've heard that before quite a few times, but I know you have a lot of stories from the Adirondacks. You've done some pretty awesome adventures out there. You've created your own trail, which we'll get into later. But I'm really interested as a fellow paddler. I haven't heard you talk yet about your Susquehanna River paddle. You did some big mileage. What was that like for you, man? Because paddling's a different ball game from backpacking. It's like a world apart.
It's totally different. And paddling, you can get into, I'm sure you know this, you can get into trouble pretty quick, which is different than hiking. So a good way to put it, paddling is the only sport I cannot do at night.
Yeah. Yeah.
And I've jumped out of planes at night in the military. So that's a really good measure. If you can't do it at night because it's too dangerous, it's potentially dangerous. So yeah, I'm mostly regarded as a long distance hiker and a peak bagger. And maybe people aren't aware that I've done some long distance canoe trips too. So I've done a lot of canoeing in the Adirondacks, maybe a 10-day trip, a 2-week trip, something like that. That was mostly in the 1990s. But then in the early 2000s, I had a great idea. I said, well, because I'm very goal-driven, very measured. I like to check things off of lists. And I said, I'll become the first person to paddle from source to sea the 5 longest rivers in the Northeast. And I got 2 done. I didn't get all 5 done. I only got 2 because at the time I was a teacher, so I had summers off, but then I stopped being a teacher, so it just didn't work out with the schedule. But I got 2 really long ones done. One is the Susquehanna, and that's the longest river in the Northeast. It starts in the Catskill Mountains, and then it flows through New York and Pennsylvania to and part of Maryland a little bit to dump out in Chesapeake Bay. That's 460 miles.
Wow.
I did it with a good friend of mine. We camped out every night, and it took 16 days. And just right from the top to the bottom. It was great. We did it in November. So very, very cold, some snow and ice at the beginning, but then it warmed up once we got south a couple hundred miles. And I had a great time, and I was still working towards that all 5 goal. So then I did the Delaware River by myself, and it is 360 miles. And that was very difficult. The Susquehanna is actually very easy. It's basically all flat water. There's a little class 2 here and there, maybe a little class 3. The area on the Susquehanna, well, it's literal, are the dams. There are some really big dams. Some are so big you have to actually arrange with the power company beforehand, and they pick you up and portage you around. And I remember one ride was 9 miles. It's just these enormous hydro projects. It's just amazing. So that required quite a bit of planning. But the Delaware can be pretty nasty. It's a fast-moving river. There was quite a bit of class 3 rapids, which I had to portage around. I'm just using a little solo canoe at the time. I did that in November as well. The other challenge when you get, it was nerve-wracking, you get down towards the bottom of the river, and you have to go through some major cities. One is Philadelphia. And you have a naval shipyard there, and you have international vessels coming in, and those boats put out a 10-foot wake. And you have to really be paying attention. Obviously, you don't want to get hit broadside with a 10-foot wake. And there are some sections that you paddle through, like near the naval yard, and there's nowhere to pull in. It's just a retaining wall for like a mile. And so you have to kind of sprint past that section before a vessel smashes you like a little matchstick. But it was great. It was a nice break from hiking. Look, I really like hiking. I can only do so much hiking. So it was nice to mix it up.
Yeah, man. I mean, I feel the same way. I got into paddling recently, I don't know, within the last like 3 to 5 years. And me and my friends did a paddle of the local river, and it's like nothing. I mean, probably a handful of people have done it over the last couple of years, but it was like, we set out and we're like, we're just going to do this. It was not winter. Winter paddling would sound so brutal, but it was 137 miles. We did it in 4 days. We did like 40 miles, 30, and then like a bunch of 30-mile days back to back in like spring flood season. There's 3 dams, and it's just such a different ball game from backpacking because granted, all the gear's the same for the most part, but you got to keep it dry. You got to keep it packed in. We use kayaks. And I actually think it's super challenging. Like backpacking, you kind of get into this rhythm and you do the same thing over and over. But with canoeing and kayaking, there's just you can smack a rock and flip over, and you have to portage, which is brutal, but it's so much fun. And you're no stranger to brutality. But man, I love paddling. But recently I've gotten into mountain biking, and I saw that you've done 2 probably more, but you've done 2 super long mountain biking trips. How the hell did you pull that off? Because I can barely jump anything at this point, let alone ride like 2,000 plus miles. So tell us a little bit about, I want to hear about the Canada to Mexico one first. That sounds so cool.
It was pretty, I'm partial to my own adventures, but it was pretty cool. I love bikes. I've been riding bikes since I was a little kid. I love bicycles, especially mountain bikes. I got into mountain bike racing kind of when mountain bikes came out. I was in my first mountain bike race in 1991. This was back like bikes didn't even have suspension. This is the fully rigid bike. This is old school stuff. It was just wonderful. So I got into racing, and it just became too competitive. I like to compete with myself, but against others, sometimes it gets a little nasty, and I just wasn't enjoying myself, but I still wanted to ride. And in 2005, I did the Canada to Mexico ride. And so I combined my 2 loves. I had a lot of experience mountain biking and racing. And then by that time, I had hiked a few long distance trails in the United States. And I was like, hell, I'll just put them together. So I got to the Canadian border sometime mid-August, maybe 2005. And the intention was to ride all the way to Mexico on a route I designed myself. So I bought some topographic gazetteers of Idaho, Wyoming, Montana, Utah, and Arizona. And I spent about a month just kind of tracing a thin ribbon of land. I wanted to go well off the beaten track. I wanted to ride off pavement as much as possible. So long story short, that trip was about 2,700 miles. Took 52 days. And I camped out every night except 4. And that's because I was gravely ill. Somebody let me actually stay in their house. But other than that, I was camping the whole time. And it was just great diversity. I mean, up in Montana, and Wyoming, you've got grizzly bear country and lodgepole pine and ponderosa pine. And then the high plateaus of Utah. It was absolutely stunning. At one point, I was riding at over 11,000 feet. That was the high point. And then you just descend into red rock country. And then Arizona is about half forested plateau, half desert. I took my bike apart and carried it through the Grand Canyon. I don't know why.
You're an animal. That's why.
Yeah, I do not recommend it. I don't know. And then eventually reached the U.S.-Mexico border down in Arizona. And it was just, it was amazing. That was actually my 3rd long distance ride and my last one so far.
Really? So that stuff like kayaking and mountain biking adds another technical element, because you got to know, like backpacking, you have to know your gear, but it's pretty basic. With biking, you got to know how to fix it. Do you have any like breakdowns or anything that took a while to repair, or was it pretty smooth sailing?
Yeah, I had I tried to go as light as I could, and so I only had a pair of panniers, a pair of saddlebags on the back, and I knew the rear wheel was taking some stress, and eventually it just kind of folded. And I was in the middle of nowhere. It's 2005, so this is like, I didn't get my first cell phone, so probably like 2015. I was one of the last Americans to get one. So I was just kind of stuck, and I just pushed my bike and came across a state park. And I actually didn't know how to true a wheel. I had a spoke wrench, but I didn't know what to do. And it was like a Three Stooges scene, because I talked the people at the state park into letting me use their phone. And I called a bike shop back in New York that knew me. And they just kind of talked me through this narrative as I'm holding the phone and adjusting the wheel with one hand. It was just really funny, but I was definitely in a bind. And that's the thing, that's another challenge, because also when I paddled the Delaware, I got a hole in my boat. I backed into a piece of rebar that was sticking out of the river. And like, oh my God, what am I going to do? My boat's going to sink. And it's the same with a bike. Oh my God, this wheel won't even fit through the frame. What the hell am I going to do? That's the only thing I don't like about paddling and mountain biking trips is, what if you crack the frame on your bike? what are you going to do?
Walk?
I don't know what I would do. Where backpacking, it's like, I don't know, maybe I break a shoelace.
Yeah.
Well, then I just use a piece of cord that I have in my pack. You can't have like a catastrophic gear failure by just walking.
No, I had the worst thing that happened to my pack on the Appalachian Trail is the brain ripped off. And I was like, well, I just sewed it back together with some dental floss. Took like 5 minutes and that was it. Like, well, here we go. I can still walk, But yeah, the gear stuff. Did you have to adapt your gear? Because I actually wanted to get into more as I get more skilled with mountain biking. I wanted to get into some like overnight bike packing stuff just to try it. How did you have to adapt your gear? Did you just kind of use your same backpacking stuff?
Yeah, so this is back when I was really organized with gear. So I would have gear lists and I would weigh everything, and I was really methodical. Nowadays, I just throw stuff in a pack and go. But back then, I still recall, I basically took my lightweight long distance hiking setup. So tarp, sleeping bag. I had a beer can stove, homemade beer can stove at the time. For the northern part of that Canada Mexico ride, a bear resistant food canister. So it was all the same. The only thing I really had to add were the panniers on the bike, waterproof covers for those. And then I had to assemble my toolkit. Mm-hmm. And the toolkit was pretty significant. So I would have a multi-tool, tire levers, an extra tire, extra tubes, especially as you get down into the desert. At that point, I had to bring more tubes because of all the thorns.
Yep.
As I got down to Arizona, I actually stopped at a bike shop and squeezed into the tube. It's called slime. It looks like slime from Ghostbusters. So when you get a thorn or a nail, and it works incredibly well, that goo kind of goes towards the opening. When it hits the air, it hardens. Because I remember when I got back to New York after that trip, I still remember this. I pulled 47 thorns out of the tire. They were all significant, like nails. So it was basically my lightweight backpacking setup with just, with just that toolkit. I think everything was the same. When it came to paddling, of course, I couldn't use my pack. I'm using a very durable, just heavy dry bag that I could throw around in the sand and stuff like that. And then you don't want to wear Gore-Tex in salt water because it eats the Gore-Tex. So I actually had a rubberized pair of bibs and a rubberized jacket. It looks like I was going on like a Deadliest Catch. It was like that. So you need something really durable, especially if it's pouring. With backpacking, you can go sit in a lean-to. Some people use an umbrella. I have a pack cover. I have a hood. But in the middle of a river, it's just raining cats and dogs. And so I needed something solidly waterproof.
Yeah, and it just changes the game like big time with when you get water involved. It's like we were wearing, it was still pretty cold. We were wearing like not dry, wet suits or dry suits, whichever, I forget the correct term. But then, you get like weird, your pores get clogged up, and we were like spending like 3-4 days after the trip was over. It felt like pins and needles in our back and stuff. So it's like, it changes things so much. The gear's the same, except for you got to use dry bags instead of backpacks. But that's one of my favorite things about the outdoors is like, once you have a good lightweight setup of whatever, backpacking, kayaking, blah, 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 it's all the same. You invest big in the beginning and then you just use it forever. It's all the same stuff.
Yeah, pretty much. I've hiked long distance trails and climbed mountains all over the U.S. and it's pretty much the same exact packing list everywhere I go. I mean, maybe somewhere I'll need a bear resistant food canister. If I go back in the Northeast, I know it's going to rain, so maybe I'll bring a better rain jacket. But yeah, you're absolutely right. Other than that, after a few trips, you just kind of get this standard gear list. That's probably why I don't make gear lists anymore. I've probably been using the same thing for 10 years. You
just know after a while. So you did the U.S.-Mexico border ride prior to the Canada-Mexico trip?
Yeah, so Canada-Mexico was in 2005, and then I rode the entire U.S.-Mexico border. That was during the winter of 2003, 2004, and that's the wildest trip I've ever been on.
Really? In what way? I thought it would be way less dramatic from the Canada to the Mexican border.
It can be quite dangerous. Yeah, it could be quite dangerous. So when I was planning the trip, I actually spoke to quite a few Border Patrol offices and Border Patrol agents. I had two goals riding the U.S.-Mexico border. One, ride off pavement as much as possible and ride as close to the border as possible.
Okay.
And pretty well. About 60% was on dirt. And then I think 75% was in the borderland. And the borderland is within 30 kilometers of the wall. So sometimes I'm riding right against the wall. And the Border Patrol warned me, and nobody had ever done it before. And nobody's ever done it since. Some people have ridden road bikes, but nobody's ridden it off-road ever. To the best of my knowledge, I'm still the only person to do it. And they were frank with me, and they said, look, dude, you have all the stuff people want. A bike, you've got a tent, you've got a sleeping bag, you've probably got some money. And they're like, you need to be really careful about getting wrong. Like, this is not, and I'm from upstate New York. I don't know anything.
Yeah.
And it worked out well. They gave me some really good advice. They're like, dude, keep a low profile, keep an eye on your shit all the time. Bring attention to yourself, And I said, well, I'm going to be camping. And they were like, oh my God. They're like, dude, are you serious? I was like, yeah, I'm camping the whole time. And they're like, man, just find like a patch of cactuses and camp in it. And just like, don't make yourself obvious because, dude, as people are moving north, they want a bike, they want a sleeping bag, and they're just going to take it. And I was like, all right, that's cool. And there are actually some really remote sections of the U.S. border, U.S.-Mexico border. A lot of people, they think about the border, they think of El Paso, San Ysidro, Tucson, the major cities down there. But some sections are so remote that the Border Patrol patrols on horseback. They can't even get vehicles in. It's like these rugged canyons. It was absolutely stunning terrain. That's probably my favorite trip I've ever done. But you have to be very vigilant down there. So it's funny. I'll be riding along, near the wall, off-road, kind of remote, and there'll just be a huge sign in huge letters. It just says, be aware of your surroundings. That's all.
Wow.
So it can get, I guess, hairy, but for me, I was totally safe and had a great time. It's a totally different culture, obviously, than upstate New York. I mean, you might as well just go to Guatemala. It was totally different. New York. It was a great trip, and I'm really glad I did it. Yeah.
That's when I was a younger man. I was a punk, and I played in a bunch of heavy metal bands, and we went on tour, and we played cities on the border, and we had people telling us the same thing. They were like, go to the venue, play the show, and leave. Do not hang around. Do not play around. This is not a place where you want to start anything. And we were like, I was like 18. I was like, okay, you got it, guys. Like, this was people at the venue. They're like, you guys are from Ohio, okay? You have no idea what's going on here. Get out as soon as you're done. And thankfully back then, I was scared and terrified. I listened to them. So I feel your pain there. So moving on, I know that you are a proponent of not filtering water. Do you have stipulations on that, or is that just like a hard rule for you? Because I know the opposite is preached in every single thing you ever read. Like, mainstream backpacking everything is Sawyer filter, Sawyer filter, Sawyer filter. So I was interested to get your perspective on that, because I've never heard. I've heard people say that, but not anyone who's done as much stuff as you. Like, you've lived it. So what's that all about?
Well, it's interesting. Not only are you the first person to ask me about mountain biking, canoeing, and nobody touches this subject with a 10-foot pole. They just don't want anything to do with me. And I'll give you a very brief history of why, how I drew certain conclusions. Now, I'm actually formally trained as an outdoor leader. So one of my degrees is in wilderness leadership. And of course, they taught us to treat all our water, and there wasn't a lot of emphasis on hygiene. And you still see that today, right? So you'll have trail clubs saying, hey, treat your water, but they don't really address hygiene, and that's where the problem is. So I kind of student became master. I became an outdoor educator myself. I taught at a couple universities. I started in 2004 teaching, and I taught for about 7 years. And I needed to select a textbook. And so I called a bunch of publishers, and they mailed me textbooks because maybe, I'll make my students buy them. And there's a book by Chris Townsend. Chris Townsend's amazing. He's a very, very accomplished long-distance hiker from Wales or England, I forget, but he's hiked quite a bit in the U.S. And in there, he says, I never treat my water. It's totally silly. All you need to do is have good hygiene. You'll never get sick. I said, what? Says who? So I went into the back, into the bibliography, and I read all the sources that he cited, which range from other books to academic journals, peer-reviewed journals, everything. And it was clear that hikers are getting sick from poor hygiene. So basically what happens is a backpacker goes into the woods, they drink some untreated water, they're eating some food, maybe they're with a group, something like that. And then a week or two later, they become ill. They have some kind of gastrointestinal illness going on. And a couple things happen at that point, and this is where the story just goes off the rails. This is where evidence takes a backseat to just to false belief. Okay, one, they'll say that they have giardiasis, but they never get tested. They're just like, I don't know. It's the untreated water. The Adirondack Mountain Club told me to treat my water, and I didn't, and so I got giardiasis. So they're just guessing. Chances are they don't have giardiasis. What happened is they got sick from eating spoiled food or eating out of a dirty pot. So it's just a basic foodborne illness. Or and it's about as gross as it sounds, they actually did get giardiasis from direct fecal-oral contact. So what happens is I could be carrying giardiasis right now, and I show absolutely no symptoms. And then you and I go hiking. I go to the bathroom. I didn't wash my hands. I come back, and you say, oh, my God, Eric, you got to try this gorp. And I reach my hand in. And we don't know, but I have these little particles of fecal matter on it. I reach in, and I go, wow, that is really good gorp. Have some more. And you reach in, and that's where it gets gross, direct fecal-oral contact. So I stopped counting years ago. I've drunk over 2,000 untreated quarts. I've never had giardiasis. And what's even more important is when I used to be a trail crew leader, when I used to be an outdoor educator, I would give my crew members or my students the articles that I read back in 2004. And I said, hey, look, if you want to treat your water, that's fine. I'm not going to make fun of you. Do whatever you want. Okay. If you don't, or if you do, either way, we're going to pay really good attention to hygiene. Mm-hmm. So if you want water, that's fine. But good hygiene is not optional on my trips. I never had a student ever treat their water, but they all paid really good attention to hygiene. Collectively, they drank over 2,000 quarts too. And when you know it, no one got sick.
Wow. Yeah, it's all the rhetoric you hear about everything is treat it. And I don't want to go one way or the other. I've always treated my water. So that's why I was very interested in your opinion on the Appalachian Trail. It was like every person was like treat. So that's all we know. I mean, do you think, are there stipulations on that though? Like you do not probably want to drink out of the Delaware River or something where there's human, like people are physically there on the cities. Like I could see where you're coming from in some way, like if you're in the back country and it's coming out of like a spring at the top of the mountain or something. But if you're like where I live, if you were to drink out of the Maumee River right now, I guarantee you would not have a good time.
Oh, yeah. We were just talking about the U.S.-Mexico border. One year, the Rio Grande caught on fire. So I probably wouldn't drink that, talk about fire water. So in all the research I've done and the articles I've written about this and the people I've educated about it, I always say backcountry water, just backcountry water. It could be a backcountry spring, stream, lake, river, whatever. Basically, if you're out in the wild, you're good to go.
Interesting. Yeah. So that is definitely the opposite of what everyone hears. But I mean, you're a man of research. You've written a shitload of books. I mean, you lived the life. I mean, I'm looking at your website right now. The list of trails you've hiked is mind blowing. And speaking of which, I did want to touch on the Florida Trail a little later because that it's just interesting to me. And I know a lot of people who've kind of talked about it, but I think one trail we actually have in common for at least half of it is the Long Trail. That gets looked over a lot. Vermont is a beautiful country. What was your thru-hike experience like on the Long Trail? Because I love that. Yeah, the Long Trail is a gem. That was my second long distance hike ever. My first was the Northville Placid Trail in upstate New York in 1995. That's 135 miles, and I was like, all right, that's pretty cool. I said, well, maybe I'll kind of step it up. Let's try something twice as long. And the Long Trail is precisely twice as long. So I thru-hiked that in 1998. I started down on the Massachusetts border and went up to Canada. And the Long Trail is good for a certain personality. So would I hike the Long Trail now? I don't think so. I mean, that thing is rugged. And not a lot of people know this. Mile for mile, that's the most rugged long distance trail in the United States. Because really? When I wrote my first book about long distance trails way back in 2005, I actually figured out how many vertical feet long distance trails in the United States climb, and I divided it by mileage. And the Long Trail is only 270 miles long, but it climbs to about 70,000 vertical feet. That's more than the Tahoe Rim Trail, the John Muir Trail, the Colorado Trail. Per mile, no other long distance trail climbs as much. So in 1998, I was 25 years old. So for a robust 25-year-old, Long Trail's awesome. For a 47-year-old guy, I don't know. And it's funny, I don't know if I'm getting smarter or kind of wimpy. I really don't have the answer, and I'm still trying to figure this out. It's like my midlife crisis. I'm going with maybe I'm a little bit smarter. But it's a great trail. They have these unique shelters where they kind of look like little barns, and the trail's very well maintained, and they have a really good guidebook. And everybody, it's Vermont culture too. Just everybody perpetually on vacation in Vermont. I don't know what's going on up there. So it's a gem, but again, it's for a certain type of personality. Well, that makes me feel better because I feel like that the half of the trail I hiked on the thru-hike kicked the living crap out of me. I was
it's tough.
That's when it starts getting really hard, like brutal up there. But it is beautiful and muddy and disgusting, and but it's a beautiful trail. And yeah, like you said, I don't know, they must eat too much Ben and Jerry's up there in Vermont or something because everybody's just like, yeah, baby, it's time to chill out. But so the Florida Trail, Florida's an odd place for me because you have the East Coast, you have the Appalachian Trail, you have the West Coast, you have the Pacific Crest Trail, and you have in the middle of the country, you have the Rockies. And then Florida is like, it's just Florida. When you say Florida, you have this image in your head, alligators, swamps, hot, humid. What was that experience like compared to all this like mountain stuff you've done? It had to be extremely different.
Yeah, the Florida Trail is the redheaded stepchild of long distance trails. It's very interesting. I'm a fan. I'm a real big fan. I tell people there are 3 long distance trails I would hike again. One would be the Trans-Adirondack Route. Another would be the Tahoe Rim Trail. And surprisingly enough, another one would be the Florida Trail. And I probably like the Florida Trail because it's different, and if folks haven't figured it out by now, I just like to do what other people aren't doing. So I've never thru-hiked the Aptitude Trail and probably never will. So I thru-hiked the Florida Trail in 2002, and I did it during February and March. You would have to be foolish to, try to hike it during the warmer months. That would be a disaster.
No thanks.
So, I started out, I was southbound, so I started out on the Panhandle, and you cut across the Panhandle, and you go through a couple of national forests, you go around Lake Okeechobee, and then it ends basically on the border of northern border of Everglades National Park. It took me 2 months. I think that was like 23, 24 miles a day. And back in 2002, man, nobody was hiking this thing. I think that year there were 4 thru-hikers, and that's counting myself. And nowadays, I think it's actually kind of popular. I think they're getting like 40 or 50, maybe even more a year. But back then, it was just 4 of us. That was it. And I did like it because it was different. I'm a mountain climber by nature. I grew up in the mountains. Now I live in Colorado, and I'm just a mountain guy. But again, I mean, even me, I can only hike so many mountains. And I really did it for 2 reasons. One, just to do something different for the sake of doing something different. But it was very nice. Also, it's a great destination if you live in Ohio, if you live in New York, if you live in Vermont, and you're like, you know what, I can't do another winter. I can't do it. I'm going to go insane. And so you can go to Florida and hike for 2 months straight.
That's what everybody from Ohio does. They live in Ohio, and then it gets cold and they retire, and they're like, screw this, and they move to Florida. Yeah. That's like the thing people in Ohio do. So that's why it's pretty funny. So moving on to kind of your staples, I would say. The Trans-Adirondack route is kind of your baby. You created that. It sounds like, I believe you describe it as the thru-hiker killer or the thru-hiker crusher or something along those lines.
Yeah, it's the Triple Crown Crusher.
That's what I was looking for. That sounds terrifying. So that's your baby. Why don't you tell the people what is so special about this trail, why it's so damn hard, and why you made this awesome trail in the Adirondacks?
Yeah. So the Trans-Adirondack route is a 240-mile primitive path that traverses the entire Adirondack Park of upstate New York. So the Adirondack Park's pretty big. It's 6 million acres, and a little more than half is public land, and so a little bit less than half is private land. And 6 million acres is roughly the size of Connecticut. It's roughly the size of Vermont. So it's a big park. It's the biggest park and forest preserve in the lower 48. It doesn't get a lot of press because it's not federal land. So, everybody's Grand Canyon and Zion, et cetera, but the Adirondacks are, maybe that's another redheaded stepchild somehow. So you have to go back to 2010. I had a couple weeks off. I had nothing to do. And I said, well, I've already climbed every 3,000-foot peak in the range, and I hiked the Northville Placid Trail 4 times. I did this and did that. I was like, well, what else is there to do? I said, I bet nobody's ever hiked across the Adirondack Park, and no modern-day hiker has. So long story short, I started on the northern border of the park. It's only 8 miles from Canada, and 240 miles, and 12 days later, I reached the southern border of the park. And I did that by just piecing together scores of standard hiking trails, a little bit of road walking, snowmobile trails, abandoned paths, a little bit of off-trail travel to just try to, it was like a little puzzle going across this 6 million acre park. And I just did it for fun. I really wasn't anticipating anything to happen after I reached the end. But I got to the end, I said, wow, that was challenging, beautiful, wild, unique. It was just a great journey. And then I said, I bet somebody else will hike this thing. And so I wrote a guidebook and came out with a map set. And we're up to about 20 thru-hikers so far. The route officially opened in 2013.
Nice. And, I talk to James of 4646 podcast quite regularly, and he's like, man, that's a hard trail, man. Like I think he'll do it someday, but I personally don't have a ton of experience with land nav. Like I've taken courses, but it's not something that's offered very often. I had to go out of my way to find land nav courses, and it's really confusing to learn on your own. So I don't know, could you give like a quick primer on kind of how to land nav at like a basic level, because most people just don't know. Like a compass is like, it points north. That's what most people think of it. I talk to people all the time about like trying to like understand how vital a map and compass is. And a lot of people are just like, never used one, have no idea. So even if you take a map, it's worthless if you don't know how to look at it, you know?
Right. Especially nowadays, most people just grab their phone, but it doesn't work everywhere. And so it's really good to know how to navigate. I'm really fortunate. I had a New York State forest ranger teach me how to use a map and compass when I was 13.
Wow.
So I've been doing it for 34 years now. So I'm just kind of good at it. Yeah. And I also, from growing up in the Adirondacks, I mean, some parts of it are like a South American jungle. So I tell people for every 100 bearings, 100 compass bearings I would take in the Adirondacks, I could see my destination maybe 2 times. Wow. It's just foliage. And it's just pure map and compass. So the basics are you can't have one without the other. What's the sense in having a cheeseburger without fries, right? So you've got your topographic map and your compass, and they work in unison. But the third thing that I see a lot of beginner navigators do is they rely on them too much. So if you have a good navigator, they're going to have their map, they're going to have their compass. They'll use those two about 40, 50% of the time, and the other 50 or 60% of the time, they're looking around. The big mistake I see, and I used to teach land nav, is that they're looking down, and they're like, where is this lake? And it's like 200 feet over there. I'm like, dude, you have to look. So it's just kind of interpreting the terrain, right? So those three really work in unison together. And maybe it's a good testament of how much reading the terrain plays a role is if you could drop me off in the woods with a map or a compass, I would always take the map. I would always take the map because I can use the sun to figure out where south, west, north, east is and stuff like that. So those two really go in unison, but you really have to be aware of your surroundings. The most important thing I would teach people in land navigation, and I do it myself, and I got this habit from the military. It's actually one of my good habits I got from the military, is I always know where I am. Like, always. And in the military, they would teach you that because, God forbid there's an accident or I wasn't in combat, so it was just all these simulated combat missions. And all the time, somebody would just come up to me, one of my sergeants or a lieutenant or a captain, and they'd be like, Schlimmer, where are we? And I would have to point to precisely where we were. So we would have a person out front navigating, but everybody has their own map, own compass, and so we're always aware of where we are. And so when I taught land nav, I would let students get lost. I knew where I was, right? And they would eventually just kind of wander off, and then they'd have to stay in this terrible, crappy campsite, and it's like they're cooking in the dark and stuff like that. But that's how you learn, right? It would be a disservice to them if they were going off track, and I was like, oh, you guys are going off track, because I'm going to be there for them. So it's kind of like in life, you fall down and you scrape your knees a little, and then you pick yourself back up, and that's how you learn through these teachable moments. Land navigation for me is just fun because I like to think. So I've never used a GPS. I just always use a map and a compass because it's like a chess game, So, all right, I look around and that hill's over there. All right, well, that kind of looks like this on the map. And then I looked at my watch and I was like, well, I've been going for 2 hours, 20 minutes. All right, so that's probably 2.1 miles because I kind of know my pace. Mm-hmm. And you get these little pieces of information and you become a detective. And then you learn how to navigate that way. It's really a thinking person's sport.
Yeah, and I think a lot of people get intimidated because they see, like, they'll watch a YouTube video or something, they see, and then you're like trying to find coordinates and this and that. But really at a base level, you're right. It's like, here's this thing. If I find it on the map and navigate to north, there we are. I'm at least generally within where I need to be. And that's super important. And I know you're kind of like not a big technology guy. And a lot of people today are relying on technology a lot. And, you know, I've learned the hard way quite a bit with, like, I'm not an anti-technology guy. Look at my background here. I got a bunch of crap in here, but like not knowing how to use a map and compass at a basic level is kind of dangerous, especially if you're trying to plan how to do a trip or anything. Like the Appalachian Trail, there's white blazes everywhere. You turn off a trail, the worst thing that happens is you just turn around. But, you know, that's a vital skill. But anyway, you're also an author. That's impressive to me. Like, I feel like you're like me on steroids because I can't sit still, but you're like me with like 1,000 times more experience. Like I'm always doing something because I like doing this kind of stuff. So how does it feel to write a ton of books? Like, are you just naturally driven to writing, or is it just something you picked up, or have you always been a writer?
Well, it goes back to the Florida Trail. It's funny. So we have to go back to 2002, and I finished the Florida Trail. My good friend flew down to meet me, and she says, "Oh my God, you got to tell me about this hike. You know, you've been hiking for 2 months. Probably some crazy stuff happened." So I was just sharing these stories with her. And she says, apparently the stories were good because she said, "You got to write a book. You know, write a book about your thru hike." And I had never written before. I've always been a heavy reader. I've always been a reader. And that's how I learned to write. I'm not a trained writer. That's how a lot of people learn how to write, is they just read a lot of good books so you can see what's going on. And I said, I don't know about that. It sounds kind of conceited, you know, just write about myself. And I said, well, maybe I'll write a guidebook. And so I wrote a guidebook that was published by McGraw-Hill, and it was basically a guide to all the long distance trails in the United States between 100 and 1,500 miles. And so that got published. And it was okay. I wasn't a very good writer back then. I just wasn't good. Right? So luckily I picked up a major publisher, and they've got, you know, the proofreaders and the editors and the typesetters. I just handed them my decent manuscript, and they put a nice shine on it. And in 2013, I wanted to write a guidebook for the Trans-Adirondack route, maybe 2012. And working with a major publisher, it's a very impersonal experience. Like, they reminded me of my Army recruiters. I mean, once you sign the contract, they don't talk to you anymore. You know, it's one of those. So somebody's like, "Hell, why don't you just start your own little publishing company?" I was like, yeah, I guess that's a good idea. So by that point, I was actually a halfway decent writer. I hired an editor, a typesetter. Typesetter is the person you just send them a Word document and actually make it look like a book. I had a graphic designer, did all my own photography. And here we are. I have my 8th book coming out on New Year's Day. And it, again, comes down to, I like to think, right? So it's like I'm using a map and a compass in the woods, and I got to piece together, you know, some pieces of information. Writing's really difficult. I mean, to write a really good sentence, like a really good sentence, you know, maybe it has some humor, it's very sharp, you're not using vague pronouns, people can follow it. It's actually quite a lot of work. And the books I write are pretty thick and historically dense. So with every sentence, I'm just trying to, like, should I put in the year 1832 blank, or should I put they built a grist mill in 1832? Like, what's you have to make a decision with every sentence. I find it rewarding because I like to think, but it's amazingly, it's almost indescribably rewarding when somebody reads one of my books and I go to check my email and there's a message from one of my readers. And they're like, "Hey, I really enjoyed this because of blank." I like doing that because, being a heavy reader, I've had hundreds of authors bring me great joy. So it's just nice to return the favor in a way.
Yeah, man, I'm a big reader myself. It was 2 years ago. I set out, like, every year I like to kind of give myself like a hard, like, thing to do, like a task that's like a year-long task. And like 2 years ago was to read 100 books. It was brutal, but it was fun. And I just, like, you don't remember everything you learn in a book, but you just get so much good information. And I mean, I was doing this thing where I I would just go, I have an app on the library app, and I would just download whatever was available. I was like particular. I just started reading books, and it's so crazy. I know you're a huge fan of nonfiction, and so am I. I prefer nonfiction, but I started reading all these weird fiction books and like great American authors and Stephen King and stuff I never would have read. And I was just like, it's a fun experience, and you learn so much. Do you have like I know this is a terrible question. You should never ask this question to anyone, but do you have like a favorite book or like style of book that you really enjoy, like travel adventure or historical adventure like Lewis and Clark or something along those lines?
Yeah, it's funny you mentioned Lewis and Clark because two authors immediately came to mind. One is Stephen Ambrose.
Oh, yeah.
Ambrose wrote D-Day, Band of Brothers, the popular movie. Undaunted Courage is his book about the Lewis and Clark expedition.
Love that book.
And then he also wrote Nothing Like It in the World, which is about the Transcontinental Railroad. It's just
check that out.
Really, really interesting stuff. Ambrose is, I might be deceased, so maybe I should say was. He's really good. America's greatest historian is David McCullough. That's it. And that's a fact. He's written a book about the Panama Canal, the Brooklyn Bridge. I mean, look, you have to be a really good writer to write an amazing 700 or 800 page book about a bridge, just a bridge. So to pull that off, it's one of my favorite books. It's just about a bridge. That's really, really good. David McCullough and Stephen Ambrose are just amazing. Since I work in mental health, so I kind of deal roughly here and there with kind of social issues. I'm also, I like reading books about economics and stuff like that. The greatest social historian is Thomas Sowell. And not a lot of people have heard of Thomas Sowell. He's, I guess you could call him a social historian and an economist. He just turned 92 the other day, and he's a senior fellow at Stanford University. He's influenced my writing quite a bit. He's a very eloquent writer. Really, the best books are probably from the 1800s. And writing styles change kind of every few decades. Mm-hmm. So we have like the Kurt Vonnegut, Ed Abbey stuff from like the 60s and 70s, and now we have some different books coming out today. But people in the 1800s wrote really well, especially the adventure books. So for example, Exploration of the Colorado River and its Canyons by Powell, first guy to run through the Grand Canyon. Just a really good writer. In my top 10, another book back from there was Sailing Alone Around the World by Slocum. And it's the guy who became the first guy to sail around the world solo. It's great. And what authors did back then, which you don't see too much today, especially in younger authors, is the understatement. Okay. They really said anything extreme. So I remember I was reading this book about by William Herndon. He was an American Navy man, and it was an American Navy expedition of the late 1800s to paddle the Amazon from source to sea. It was crazy, and it started at like 20,000 feet in the Andes, and it is just sweltering, disgusting, hot, humid, crazy mosquitoes for like the last month because the water's not even moving, on a few hundred miles. And I still remember he just wrote, the mosquitoes were intolerable. That's it. That's all he wrote.
That's all you need to say.
Nowadays, it's no disrespect to these authors. Nowadays, somebody will write about, maybe a through hike up the Appalachian Trail, and they go through Mahoosic Notch. And it's like this way over the top, death-defying experience. Where back then they were much gentler in their words and maybe a little more modest.
Well, yeah. I mean, the books I've read and the historical stuff I've read about people from even like the 1600s through the 1500s through the 1800s, 1900s, they were some ballsy dudes doing
crazy
shit.
Crazy.
Like
yeah,
now.
one of the most fascinating groups of people were Spanish conquistadors. I mean, they were insane. The stuff they did is crazy.
The thought, like, okay, so I mean, like Lewis and Clark was a light example of stuff. Like they just went across America. People were traveling around the world. They didn't have, like nowadays you can go to Walmart and you can buy dehydrated food and mac and cheese and throw it in your backpack and be like, I'm an adventurer. But back then they were like, I had to kill a seal and eat its intestines to stay alive. And I wrapped its blubber around my body so I didn't die. Like everyone's so soft nowadays. Yeah. It's crazy. I think about that all the time when I'm complaining. It's like,
Magellan. I read a fascinating book about Magellan by Lawrence Bergreen, and it's got a great title, Over the Edge of the World. The Spanish conquistadors, any seafarer back in the 1500s, 1600s, I'd last like 2 days, and I'd be like, take me back to the port. We're done. I'm out.
They'd throw you off the ship and you drown.
Yeah, they just throw me overboard. Yeah.
I'm a big fan of, you a fan of William Cronin, his historical stuff?
No, I'm not familiar with him.
He does a really great job of putting like anthropology and history together. He's he's a Harvard professor, I believe. I could be wrong there, but his writing is it's on the verge of being like college writing. It's kind of dry, but the connections he makes between the environment and human history will like completely blow your mind. Like I've read, I would say 4 or 5 of his books, and like he just has a way of making these historical connections that are just mind-blowing, like colonial, Native American, and how they interacted. And it's not this narrative that you hear all the time, like cowboys and Indians. Like he does a really awesome, I would highly recommend that. And when we're done with the podcast, I like to get a list of books to read from you, because I'm super interested in all of that stuff, because I voraciously read, not $100 books a year anymore, but I still love to read about that stuff. Like before I thru-hiked the Appalachian Trail, I read a bunch of like real nerdy books on the anthropology of like the Appalachian Trail region in like the early 1900s, late 1800s. So I'm right there with you.
Good.
One thing I kind of want to touch on, I know we're probably getting close to an hour here. I have no idea. I didn't even start paying attention, but do you, in your licensed therapist now, do you use the outdoors in any way to work with people? Is that something that you've kind of started doing? Because I know a lot of people are into that, or are you just kind of doing the standard stuff?
Well, the short answer is no. And that's due to COVID-19. Mm-hmm. So I work in an office. I'm a licensed therapist here in Colorado Springs. But I work with an organization called Huts for Vets. They're based out of Basalt, which is out by Aspen. And I'm alumnus of a Huts for Vets trip. So it's that wilderness therapy model. It's also a peer support model. So everybody on the trip is a veteran. Most of the leaders of these trips are veterans. And they wanted to bring me on to lead a couple trips this summer, but unfortunately, they all got canceled due to travel sometimes, but it's a tight packed group. And the restrictions here in Colorado have gotten really tight over the last couple of weeks. So unfortunately that got canceled. When I do an intake with a client at the office I work at, one of the questions involves, physical activity. What do you do? And thankfully, most of my clients, well, it's Colorado, most of my clients say, oh yeah, I'm a climber, I'm a mountain biker, I do this, I do that. And I always tell them, keep doing that. And if they don't, I say, have you considered yoga? Have you considered mountain biking? Have you considered this, that? So it certainly plays a role in mental health. When you're exercising, it's firing up your endorphins. Mm-hmm. It can also be social. So it's really nice to go maybe mountain biking with somebody, and then a conversation starts and this comes up and you can process things. But unfortunately for the summer of 2020, it looks like I'm stuck inside, but I still love the work.
And one of my buddies, his brother, he's a neuroscientist, and I talked with him quite a bit one day about, he's big into the outdoors and nature too. And I was like, do you think that this, like, like you hear a lot of stuff online, nature therapy, all this stuff. I was like, do you think this actually works? And he was like, absolutely. Like he's going to get his doctorate right now. And he's like, I 100% believe that this changes people's lives. I know it's changed my life. Definitely. Like everyone I know who gets obsessed with the outdoors, like it's a life changer. Hands down. And, you know, and I'm right there with you with like, if I have a bad day or I'm not feeling good, if I go out and ride a mountain bike trail for an hour or two, I don't have time to think about being upset or sad or whatever. I'm trying to breathe and not fall off my mountain bike. And I think it's so great for people. Like it's not a cure. It's not a medicine, but it helps alleviate the stuff, or going to the gym and just pushing yourself. Like when you're trying to breathe, your brain's thinking about that. It's not thinking about, oh, I have a test tomorrow or I'm really stressed out. It's like, so I don't know. I'm no expert. You are. I'm not.
No, you've got it. I can't think of anything bad about it. You know, if somebody's going to go out and maybe go for a run through the mountains up here or something like that, I can only see it as a benefit. The really difficult part, because most people I see, the majority of my clients suffer from anxiety or depression. Mm-hmm. Behind that is unfulfilling relationships and post-traumatic stress disorder, mm-hmm. but it's mostly a lot of depression. And the toughest part is actually being motivated enough to do it. It's very difficult. You know, the classic client with depression is the person who kind of mopes around their house in their pajamas. You know, so you say, have you considered mountain biking? That's a pretty tall order. You know, I mean, you know, do you live near, you know, where do you live? Can you go for like a 20-minute walk after dinner? You know, just that. And it's great. You know, hey, why don't you invite your girlfriend? You know, if it's a girl, you know, invite one of your girlfriends along. And then again, you get that social interaction. It becomes beneficial in two ways. You've got the physical benefit, but then you also have that social connection with somebody. The worst thing you can do when you have depression is to isolate. But unfortunately, that's a lot of people's go-to method.
Exactly. So one thing I always like to ask people, and this is like a something that I'm just personally interested on every episode I do, is, and especially with you, you have done more hiking, backpacking, kayaking, canoeing than everybody I've probably interviewed combined. So I want to hear your most insane story from any trip you've ever been on that comes to mind, like dangerous or terrifying, or like almost feel like you're going to get eaten. Anything along those lines. Like, what's the craziest shit that's ever happened to you in the outdoors?
Right. Well, fortunately, nothing death-defying and no serious injuries. You know it's a good story when the story begins with, I have to tell you about the time I found the 2 decapitated dogs.
That's the one I want to hear right now. That's the one.
This was odd. Odd would be the word. So I was living in Western North Carolina in the Appalachians. I was working for a private trail building company. And one of my hiking goals was to hike every peak above 5,000 feet in the South. Mm-hmm. Believe it or not, they have 198. It's just amazing. I mean, the Northeast has like 10. So I go up this trailless peak and I get to the summit. And it's some of the mountains down there have very dense rhododendron thickets. They're quite difficult to push through. They call them slicks. Look at it far. It's kind of a shiny slick look to it. And I look over, there's a dog, that's a dog's head. I was like, that's not something you see every day. And I went over and I'm looking at it, and then I found another one. You know, like a domesticated dog. It's like, what the hell? And I said, well, let's see, if I was some lazy redneck up here and I decapitate dogs, what would I do with the bodies? I'd probably drag them downhill and throw them off a cliff. So I went downhill and I found a cliff, and sure enough, the bodies were at the bottom. And I was like, that's really weird. So I went down to the bodies and I found a collar with a name and phone number on it.
Oh my God.
And I said, this person is probably wondering where their dogs are.
Oh.
So I threw collar in my pack, and I'm not exactly sure why. I also took one of the heads. I had a plastic bag, and I said, I don't know, maybe nobody's going to believe me. So I put it in a plastic bag, throw it in my pack. So now I'm hiking out with a dog's head in my backpack, which you've probably never heard on your podcast.
Never.
So I get into town. The nearest town is Waynesville. It's this kind of small hamlet right in the rugged mountains of the Appalachians. And I go to the police department. I say, do you have like a dog control officer, animal control, anybody like that? And they say, yeah, they're a couple doors down. So I go down, it's this very nice lady, and I told her what I just told you. And she goes, oh my God. She's like, so everything's still up there? I go, no, I got the head in my backpack. Surprise. Yeah, I take it out. I'm wearing my backpack. She's like, okay, take out this head. And she's like, that's weird. I go, yeah, I got the collar. I got a name and a number. She goes, get out. So I give her the collar and the number, and she dials the number, and somebody answers. And it's an older gentleman. And she says, hey, are you missing your dogs? And the big thing down there is to hunt black bears with dogs. These were hunting dogs. Mm-hmm. He says, yeah. And she goes, well, why don't you come in? We found your dogs. You know, she left out a little information. We found your dogs. So he comes in, and then it just got weirder because he grew up there, and his dialect was so strong, I actually could not understand him. I couldn't understand a lick of what he was saying. But she's from there, and so when he talked, she translated to me. Because I remember him saying, he goes, yeah, man, I got caught in a laurel slick. And I was like, huh? And he said, maybe they got caught up in the laurel slick. And I know what a laurel slick is. I was like, okay. And the thing was very weird because he was totally unconcerned at all. Like, no emotion. And he explained it that they got loose and they got to the top of the mountain, got caught in the laurel slick, died, and then animals partially ate them. And I was like, but how could it be that they went up for miles upon miles upon miles, and then suddenly they both got caught simultaneously on the summit? I was like, how does that work? That was kind of the end of the story, and he left, and I left her with the head, and I went home.
It reminds me of what's that scene in Dumb and Dumber? Who's saying, we got no food, we got no jobs, our pets' heads are falling off.
Yes. Yeah, with a bird.
That is not only the craziest outdoor story I've ever heard, that's the craziest story I've ever heard from someone.
Yeah.
Like the weird shit you come across in the outdoors is insane.
Yeah.
I don't think we can top that for the night. Like there's nothing that can top that.
Yeah, we got to just end there.
That's enough. So why don't you, before we go, why don't you drop all your social media and your websites and stuff so everybody can find you? Because I want people to go to these websites and buy your books and also check out the list. I'm gonna do some like intro, outro stuff. I'm gonna read every one of these adventures you went on. This is insanity, man. Like you're a fucking monster. So let's get a little promo in here, and then we will call it a day because decapitated dogs is the coolest story I've ever heard.
Yes, it's a good end point. Okay, so I have a couple of websites. The Trans Adirondack Route website is very simple. It's just TransADK, so TRANSADK.com. And then my own publishing company is Beechwood Books. So it's Beechwood, BKS.com. And then kind of like my outdoorsy, what is Erik Schlimmer up to website is thehikingveteran.com. I guess that's a nickname I have. And then we have 2 Instagram pages. So we have the_hiking_veteran is my personal Instagram page. You can see all the crazy stuff I'm doing here in Colorado. And then again, we like to keep it simple. The Trans Adirondack Route Instagram page is just Trans AD. Okay.
Thank you so much. I follow both your Instagram accounts. What is that? Before we go, what's that? What's like a quiz show you have or something? It's a super long title. Every time I see it, I laugh. I'm like, that's hilarious.
Yeah, I run a series on the Trans Adirondack Route website, and that is totally esoteric Adirondack trivia that is fun to guess. And I run that every Monday. It's just obscure, weird Adirondack trivia.
All right, Erik, thank you so much, man. I appreciate you coming on. It was a blast to talk to you about your awesome stories. And I will share this with the world, man. I appreciate you.
Pleasure was all mine.
Hey, everybody. Thank you again for checking out this episode of the Aptitude Outdoors podcast here on YouTube. I want to give a huge shout out to Erik Schlimmer for coming on the show tonight. He's one of the most awesome guys to talk to about the outdoors because he has so much experience. I'm really glad that we got to dig into some of the stories that he doesn't really get to tell too often. A lot of people like to focus on the Adirondack stuff, and I was like, I really want to hear about the other stuff that I enjoy, paddling, and a bunch of his mountain biking adventures. It's just so awesome to find someone that's maybe as ADHD as I am about the outdoors. So thanks again, Erik, for coming on. Make sure you head over to thehikingveteran.com. Check out his books, check out his travels and adventures. He's also on Instagram as The Hiking Veteran. And I will be throwing more tags down below of where you can follow Erik and all of his adventures. And if you can, please hit that subscribe button. We'd really appreciate it. We will see you all next time.